flintlock has become almost synonymous with pirates, many recognizing it purely as a pirate gun, and rightly so. Whilst the armed forces of Europe clung to the older matchlock, pirates and American colonists adapted the more rugged and field-expedient flintlock way earlier, and flintlock weapon systems would remain their favorite arm for the rest of the Golden Age. I suppose I could tell you something along the lines of, our understanding of the flintlock gives us a better understanding of pirates and their operations as a whole. But really, it's kinda just cool to talk about firearms, so I don't think any form of in-depth introduction is especially desired by anyone. In this video we're going to take an in-depth look at how the flintlock functioned, but also the preceding technology which allowed for its development. Because we usually view the flintlock as a very isolated innovation. In a lot of fantasy works it is the only firearm system present, and usually under a very narrow definition. The archetypal flintlock seen in period flicks is quite simple. A hammer holding a flint, an L-shaped piece of steel, and a pan with a hole in it. The hole is directly connected to the barrel of the gun. By pushing the hammer backwards, it locks into a safety position, half cock. Then you can safely pour priming powder into the pan and close the steel, also called a frizzen. Now you can ram down a main charge of powder, wad, and bullet into the barrel. When ready to fire, you pull the cock back to full cock and pull the trigger. This releases the hammer, which strikes the frizzen, pushing it away from the pan and creating sparks which hopefully ignite the priming powder, which in turn ignites the main charge, producing trapped gases that propel the bullet forward. That is what we call kaboom. This is the basic flintlock as we know it. However, experts define this design in particular as the French lock, or true flintlock, one of many designs all classified as flintlock. In this video, defined as any firearm using a piece of flint as its means of ignition. This is also how the term was used in the period. Any gun lock fired using a piece of flint could invariably be called a snaplock, snaphaunce, flint gun, fusee, firelock, and so on, even if we'd classify them more specifically based on different mechanics. It is easy to take the basic flintlock for granted, thus ignoring the rather lengthy history of preceding innovations which led to its development. To fully understand this, we have to go back to the very beginning of handheld firearms. And if you clicked on this video, I seriously doubt you're going to complain about more gun. But if you want to skip to a specific mechanic, I leave the timestamps on screen for you to peruse. This is a handgun. Dating back to the 1300s, it is usually regarded as the ancestor of every modern firearm. Already you can find some features which would remain largely the same for the next few hundred years. It has a barrel with a touch hole connected to a pan on the outside. That's it. To fire the handgun, you simply ram your load down the barrel, prime the pan, and then you have to manually ignite the primer with some sort of flame source. Most common was a slow match. You could use anything, a heated rod, a cigar, a zip lighter if you had one. But the lighter had to be held in one hand, meaning that a handgun was difficult to aim. You could secure it against your shoulder with one hand and fire with the other, but recoil control would have been difficult. You could have kept it against your hip with your elbow, but then you couldn't properly align your shots. You could have a timed fuse, allowing you to aim with both hands, but delaying the shot significantly. You could even have a second man light it for you, but he might be needed someplace else. The first improvement seems to have come to the pan. Leaving it exposed would mean that the powder could spill or otherwise be ruined, so a pivoting pan cover allowed the gun to be primed and ready to fire at any moment. However, the pan cover always had to be manually opened before firing, a sometimes complicated extra step. Imagine this scenario. You're marching in the forest. You have your handgun, but the match isn't lit. Suddenly, your formation is ambushed by cavalry. You hurry to light the match cord, sloppily striking a flint as the blood pumps in your ears and your senses grow dull. As you finally manage to strike a light, a cavalryman sets his lance upon you. You take aim and stick the match into the pan, but you forgot the pan cover. You retract the match and lean forward to remove the pan cover, with your hand still holding the match. Will this ruin your aim? Will you ignite the primer by accident as you fumble with the cover? Is the gun even loaded? Will the cavalryman reach you beforehand? Even today, with soldiers having better drill than medieval gunners, they fumble with pouches, magazines, bolts, guns jam suddenly and they forgot how to unjam it. For this reason, handguns were the most effective upon fortifications, even inside wagon forts on the battlefield. The next improvement was the Serpentine, an S-shaped bar of metal, pivoting by its center upon the stock of the gun. The top of the S had a ring for holding the burning match cord, and by pressing the trigger, the bottom of the S upwards. This pivots the upper end forward and down into the pan, igniting the priming powder. This innovation allowed the firearm to be used reliably by a single shooter, and it is often regarded as an ancestor of, or even the first matchlock, any gun lock using a slow match to ignite the priming powder. A very important but often neglected addition was the mainspring. This is basically just a bar of steel, soft enough to be bendable, but hard enough to want to return to its natural position. By bending it, we can thus store a lot of energy which can be used in a gun lock to move the Serpentine in or out of the pan. In the earliest gun locks, a mainspring was mounted to push the Serpentine out of the pan. It is only by pressing the trigger that we can overpower and bend the mainspring, and slowly bring the Serpentine into the pan. When we release the trigger, the mainspring wants to move back to its natural position and pushes the Serpentine back up. Thus, it allowed for safer, slower, and methodical shots. As we will see throughout the video, usage and placement of the mainspring will evolve. But even to this day, mainsprings are the third most important components, after the barrel and ignition arm. The next step in gun lock development was the Sear matchlock, seemingly developed in the mid-15th century. No firearm in the pre-industrial period was ever the same. They were handmade by relatively isolated gunsmiths, meaning that every gun varied slightly. Thus, the locks I'll be presenting throughout the video are usually representative of a larger trend or classification, with slight variations within them, usually the placement or shape of individual components. Most of my recreations are based on multiple samples of the same system. Mechanically, the Sear matchlock made a huge step up from the Serpentine, as it holds as many as 8 components, and should be considered the first actual gun lock. These components are housed in a compartment cut into the gun stock itself, and covered with a steel plate. The only component placed outside of the plate is the Serpentine or cock, named after a pecking rooster. Nothing dirty, you silly boy. A distinguishing mark is that the cock falls backwards instead of forward like on most other mechanisms. Inside, the pivot on the lower end of the cock is attached to a link, which can be used to control the cock itself. The other end of the link pivots on the end of a curved arm, the Sear, which in turn pivots further back, and is held down by the Sear spring. Using the logic of a seesaw, the spring always keeps the mechanic up. But by mounting a trigger on the end of the Sear, it can be pressed upwards, overpowering the spring and felling the cock into the pan, igniting the priming powder. When the trigger is released, the lock will automatically slide back up. Thus, the Sear matchlock allowed for slow, methodical shots. It was also very reliable. There's always a chance of the powder not immediately igniting, but with this mechanism you could just hold down the trigger until it did. With other matchlocks, there is the risk of extinguishing the match when pressing it down, a minimal risk with the Sear matchlock since it always wants to bounce up. What's so interesting about the Sear matchlock is that, mechanically, it is less reminiscent of the Serpentine, more so of earlier and contemporary crossbows. So we can see how throughout firearms history, the key has always been to recycle and improve upon previous innovations, even those preceding gunpowder. Owing to its simple design and reliability, the Sear matchlock would remain the main weapon system in European armies until the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. It would see continuous modification. The best and simplest way was to replace the Serpentine trigger with a modern finger trigger, which simply required the Sear to be reshaped and the spring placed below it. The Japanese invented these nifty covers to protect the match from the elements. A less common modification was a pan cover which would automatically open upon the trigger pull, allowing for more reactive shots. You see a target, you pull the trigger, bam. The desire for quicker firing, like the snap of a finger, would lead to the development of the snap matchlock. I always thought this mechanism seemed super complicated, but it's actually quite simple, only consisting of 3 basic components. We have our cock, which now has a distinctive heel at its end. The interior part of the hammer is held in place by a rectangular bar. Below this bar sits a steel spring, which keeps the cock facing down into the pan. Finally, we have a second steel spring. On its absolute end, a button protrudes out of the lock. In the middle of the spring, a sear sticks out just above the heel of the hammer. On its other end, the spring is attached to the lock plate. By pulling the hammer backwards, the heel of the cock slips over the sear, which then jumps back out and traps the cock into a standing position. The mainspring doesn't really like this, and really wants to lie even and smack the cock right down. So by pressing the button inwards, the sear slips back inside, allowing the cock to slip over the sear and back down into the pan, igniting the priming powder. The snap matchlock seems to have originated in Bohemia during the end of the 15th century. From thence it was spread into neighboring regions, and even to Portugal. The Portuguese then exported it to India, where it was modified, mass-produced and spread across Asia. The Indonesians, Koreans and Japanese all designed their unique variants, which invariably used buttons, triggers, and even strings. The problem with the snap matchlock was that it risked extinguishing the match upon firing, which seems to have led to its abandonment in Europe by the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. But in Asia it persisted into the 19th century. Some of the Japanese snap matchlocks were even converted into caplock firearms. The trigger snap matchlock was very similar to the first, but varied in design across the world. A German example was designed as follows. The cock with the heel as we know it, but with the mainspring mounted on the outside. Inside, there is a sear pivoting sideways. At the forward end of the sear is a knob sticking out below the cock. At the backward end of the sear is a hook, to which is attached a trigger. The sear and the trigger are kept bouncy by a spring. The gun is fired by drawing the heel of the cock over the knob, and then pulling the trigger to pull the sear knob back in, allowing the cock to slip over it and into the pan. As soon as the trigger is released, the sear bounces back out again. This was basically as far as the matchlock could go. As we can see, several of its design components, the trigger and the spring-powered, forward-falling cock, would become vital components for the Flintlock, and even the later caplock and modern firearms. But the most iconic component, the flint, is still missing. Now, the slow match wasn't perfect. Just like your marriage, you constantly had to worry about keeping the flame alive. Better huff on it, just not too much. There's always a risk of the match setting your own powder charges on fire. This is why matchlock shooters were always so spread out. If you're gonna blow up, please don't take me with you. This is also why the matchlock emphasized slow shots and accuracy. If you're gonna be spread out, you might as well make it count. Matchlock muskets were often given forked rests, not because they were heavy. A soldier during drill was expected to hold it with a single hand, but again, to emphasize accuracy. So the slow reload time wasn't really seen as a problem. Again, like your marriage, if you kept the flame going, the match would still burn up and reach its end. That was kinda sad. This meant that if you were on patrol, for example, and were expected to fire at a moment's notice, the match had to be constantly lit. And of course, during most patrols, you wouldn't encounter anything except boredom, meaning that a lot of match cord was consumed for usually nothing. They weren't cheap and required some sort of industrial base, meaning that they couldn't be produced in backwater peripheries like Renaissance Scandinavia or the American colonies. One solution was the tinderlock, a piece of tree mushroom processed into tinder and then mounted in the Serpentine in place of a match. So the need for an alternative was quite old. The first implementation of a stone in a lock was the incredibly bizarre Mönchsbüchse, meaning monk's gun in German. It is essentially an esoteric flintlock handgun, invented at some point in the late 15th century. It seems to have been an attempt at two things. Firstly, a functional pistol. This can be evidenced by its small size and the hook allowing it to be worn upon a belt. And secondly, the implementation of some sort of mechanical lighter into a firearm. When talking about handguns, I mentioned the zip lighter. This was not without coincidence. Early variants of the zip lighter did in fact exist, so-called tinder boxes. The most basic kind was just a brass box with tinder in it. You manually had to strike a flint into the box to light the tinder. In the 17th century, they would design these cute flintlock lighters shaped like pistols. But in the 15th century, we might have had something like the monk's gun. Someone probably used such a gizmo to light their matchlock, and got the clever idea of installing it directly into their firearm. Medieval monks really were something else. So how did it work? It consisted of a metal barrel with a lock mounted upon it. This lock had a serpentine hammer not holding a piece of flint, actually pyrite or fool's gold, placed upon a steel rasp which ran along the entire lock. The hammer was held in place at the forward end of the lock by a stop ring. To fire the Mönchbüchse, you grabbed the rasp by the ring and pulled it back, grinding the serrations of the rasp against the pyrite, creating sparks which ignited a primer. Another type of tinderbox adapted into a firearm was the Wheellock. Here we can be almost certain of its humble origins, owing to illustrations predating mentions or finding of it as a firearm. Compared to the monk's gun, the Wheellock was quite revolutionary, because the weapon could be drawn, aimed and fired with a single hand, whereas a matchlock required its match to be lit between the unholstering and aiming. Thus, the Wheellock allowed for the design of the first true pistol. The monk's gun needed 2 hands, the Wheellock pistol only needed 1. The Wheellock consists of 3 basic parts: a hammer, a serrated wheel, and a pan with a cover. The hammer holds a piece of pyrite which creates sparks when struck. The pan holds your priming powder and is protected by a sliding cover. The bottom of it is hollow, allowing access for the wheel. The gun is loaded by spanning the wheel with a key clockwise until it clicks. The pan is then primed, closed, and the hammer pushed against it. By pulling the trigger, the pan cover opens, giving the pyrite access to the primer and wheel. The wheel spins through the pan and primer against the pyrite, creating sparks which ignite the primer. That is how the Wheellock works. But it had a lot of variants with different functionalities. The pan cover worked differently, some had wheels which spanned when you cocked the hammer, and the internal components of any Wheellock were quite delicate. Now, it's not as complicated as it might seem, but I simply don't have the time to discuss Wheellocks to any satisfying extent in this video. Aside from being the first pistol and using a rock, it really didn't have any design choices which would impact the Flintlock. But if you want to see a video entirely about Wheellocks, please tell me in the comments. Anyway, the Wheellock was very reliable, since it just created a continuous firework of sparks, basically guaranteeing that the primer would ignite. However, since the wheel needed time to spin, there was a significant delay between the trigger pull and actual firing. Nonetheless, I think the Wheellock was probably the best lock they had, but it was expensive to produce and difficult to maintain, meaning that it was only really accessible to those who could afford it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was mostly relegated to cavalrymen, officers and nobility, in the form of pistols and carbines. By the 18th, it had largely been left in the dustbin. The obvious question might be, why not just take a snap matchlock, put a piece of pyrite in it, and boom? Yeah, the first Flintlock was basically a chunkier trigger snap matchlock, sounds like a rap beat, with some extra bits added to it. Nowadays we call it the Snaphaunce. It has been endlessly disputed when, where and who invented the Snaphaunce. Italy, Germany or the Netherlands seem like the likeliest candidates, and the 1520s or 30s as a date. The earliest written mentions have both been dated to the same year, 1547. A Swedish document calling them Snaplock, Snaplock, and an Italian one calling them archibussi da fucile. The term fucile, fusil in French and fusil in English, was used as far back as the 1300s in reference to the piece of steel used for striking a light from a flint, but in the 1500s was quickly transferred to mean any flint guns. This name would persist into the golden age of piracy as a general term for flintlock muskets, and in modern French it now refers to any firearm. Most commonly, the mechanism described here is nowadays called a snaphaunce, a word originally meaning pecking rooster, but before the 19th century it could refer to any flintlock. Snaphaunce also referred to troublemakers, at least in Scandinavia and upon the continent, so I found the name to be quite charming. The earliest snaphaunce I was able to find comes from Sweden, dated to 1556. Parts of it are sadly missing, but based on other contemporary artifacts we can reconstruct what the earliest flintlock probably looked like. It has our good old friend the cock, with a very pronounced heel, and a distinctively curved shape and a really long vise, the flint or pyrite mounted at the very end, just above the pan. The pan is shielded by a slideaway sliding pan cover, similar to the one on matchlocks. Ahead we have a new addition, a piece of steel called the battery. Just below the heel of the cock is a rather pronounced knob. Let's flip around the lock and go inside to see what it does. Just like the spring on the trigger snap matchlock, the knob is directly attached to a sideways pivoting Sear, and attracted inwards by pulling the trigger. A spring helps the Sear and trigger bounce back after pulling. That's basically it for the Snaphaunce. So, operating the Snaphaunce. Firstly, the pan cover is opened, and the priming powder poured. Then the cover is closed until ready to fire, which we are now. Thus, we can pull the hammer back. The long heel slips over and is then secured by the retractable Sear. We can then pull the trigger, retracting the Sear and allowing the heel to slip over it and the hammer forward. But there will be nothing for the flint to strike. So let's cock the hammer again, and then pull the battery over the pan. Now when we pull the trigger, the flint strikes the battery, shaving off red hot steel and sending them into the pan, igniting the primer. Hooray! If you cock the hammer but don't want to actually fire, you can then push the battery forward, close the pan cover and release the trigger. Or you can simply grab onto the hammer, hold the trigger and then slowly let the hammer forward and release the trigger. This style of Snaphaunce would linger in the Scandinavian countries well into the 19th century and are known nowadays as Baltic locks, mostly distinguished by the shape of their cocks. But a purely mechanical difference was the implementation of a sliding battery in the late 16th century, functioning as a safety mechanism. You could pull the battery down, but if the sliding battery wasn't slid into position, the flint would have nothing to strike. An important note when discussing Snaphaunces is that the early iterations seem to have used pyrite instead of flints. This was because pyrite was the most commonly available fire striker at this time. However, pyrite is softer compared to flint, and whilst it lends itself excellent to the softer, more sensual movements of a wheel or rub, it wasn't as functional for a snapping mechanism like the, well, Snaphaunce. So eventually and procedurally, it was replaced by the flint. A different style of Snaphaunce would emerge in Italy and the English Channel. This latter Snaphaunce would adapt some features distinct from the Baltic lock. It had a more conventionally shaped cock and a largely identical battery. However, it was often supplied with a round plate covering the pan from the side. During striking, this prevented sparks from spilling to the side, making the Snaphaunce less likely to misfire. The mainspring has been moved inside, allowing the addition of a buffer which keeps the hammer from falling too far. Some of them were also supplied with a pan cover sliding back and forth. Instead of having to manually remove the pan cover, it would automatically open upon pulling the trigger. The mechanism was rather simple. The interior of the cock, when pushed forward, would in turn push a little arm which would push the pan cover out of position. This sort of mechanism had also been implemented for match and wheellocks. An improvement upon the basic Snaphaunce would soon be designed in the form of the Miquelet. This is a modern name applied to a lock system invariably known in period Spanish as padilla, rastrillo, piedra or pedreñal. It has several distinguishing features. Most iconic would be the large ring mounted on the screw of the hammer, which would make it easier to pull back the cock. However, this ring is simply a common feature on Spanish, Portuguese and Italian flintlocks of any kind, and they are Miquelets from, say, the Middle East, which do not have rings on them. Instead, the most prominent innovation is the combined pan cover and battery, called a frizzen. This reduced weight and made the gun easier to handle. You wouldn't have to awkwardly fidget with a pan cover in a stressful situation. It also made it cheaper to produce and repair. The face of the Miquelet's frizzen usually had these distinguishable and frankly stylish grooves, designed to enhance the creation of sparks. The frizzen distinguishes the Miquelet from Snaphaunces, and the Sear mechanism distinguishes it from the later French lock. The Miquelet diverges into two separate designs, the Italian or Roman lock and the Spanish lock. The Italian lock is more reminiscent of the Snaphaunce because it has a heel which will latch onto the full cock Sear. However, it also has a toe, which the mainspring pushes down against to force the cock forward, and this toe will also latch onto the new half-cock Sear, which functions as a safety mechanism. When the trigger is pulled, both Sears are drawn in. The Spanish lock is virtually identical, except that the mainspring goes under the cock and acts upon the heel, and both of the Sears are located in front of the cock and latch onto the toe. There is also the Portuguese Molinhas, or goat's foot lock, which differed from the Spanish design in that it had an internal instead of external mainspring. However, I was barely able to find any images of the old Molinhas, so was unable to properly learn about all the differences and animate it. It must be stressed that even though these locks have regional names, both designs could be made by gunsmiths in either region. they were quite ad hoc. They are simply named after where they first appeared and tended to be the most common. The question is who invented it first. It is not so simple to answer. The commonly accepted narrative is that a lock was designed in Spain between 1560 and 1580 as a response to the Algerian Wars of the 1540s, when the matchlock proved useless in certain weather conditions. However, the first example we have of a Snaphaunce with a frizzen can be dated to 1580 and the Italian city of Turin. The half-cock Sear did not appear until the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries, and it's uncertain where. So it depends on your definition. Do you define the Miquelet as a Snaphaunce with a frizzen, or a Snaphaunce with a frizzen and a half-cock? Either way, it's a very robust design which would persist in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern world until the 19th century, even turning into caplock conversions. I actually possess one of these myself in the form of an Arabic horse pistol from 1785, purchased specifically for this video, at least as my excuse. Well, having a proper look at the guts of it was certainly of help. Now let's take an in-depth look at how the Miquelet operates. I chose the Spanish design for this demonstration. As mentioned previously, we have the mainspring pushing against the heel of the cock, the half-cock Sear and the top Sear, the pan, and the pan cover and battery combined into a frizzen. Internally, we have two Sears. The half-cock Sear, which pivots down here and out through the bottom hole, and is on the other end connected to the trigger by a sideways running bar. The half-cock Sear is pinned in place by this spring, which holds the full-cock Sear at its end and goes out through the top hole. When you pull the trigger, the half-cock Sear pivots inward, squeezing the full-cock Sear and the spring together with it. When you release the trigger, the spring pushes both of the Sears back into position. So, firing the Miquelet. Firstly, you pull the cock back so that the foot latches onto the half-cock position. The foot will just slide over it, make a click, signifying that you can let go and let it safely fall upon the Sear. Then you open the frizzen and pour priming powder into the pan. Close the frizzen, and when ready to fire, pull the cock back to full cock until it clicks and then latches onto the top Sear. Then you pull the trigger, slipping the Sears back inside, and letting the cock fall over them and into the frizzen, slamming it forwards, opening the pan cover, and shaving red-hot steel off it and hopefully into the pan. Boom. When compared to the Flintlock we know, the Miquelet is a very unorthodox system, but by understanding the preceding locks, the Snaphaunce and Snap matchlock, we can clearly see where it got its ideas from, and decided to make improvements. The half-cock safety and the combined battery pan cover. And considering how early it was produced, it is quite ingenious, and one can speculate why it wasn't used more widely. Production cost would be the most apparent, that is the issue with flintlocks. They are more expensive to produce than matchlocks, owing to the more complicated mechanism, but are cheaper in the long term since you don't constantly have to buy more slow matches. But if you had a large army and a large production or ability to import, like Spain did, then it was definitely preferable to stick to matchlocks, for the most part. Either way, the Miquelet would become the main weapon system of Spanish arms in the 18th century, and survived as caplock conversions in the 19th, and it was a vital step in the evolution of the flintlock. The next step in the evolution of the flintlock was the Doglock. There is some confusion regarding this mechanism, because the name Doglock refers to several distinct mechanisms sharing the same feature, a safety catch behind the cock called the dog. Anyway, the first Doglock consisted of a more regular shaped hammer with an especially pronounced heel. Behind and below the heel is a square shaped, outward projecting knob, the Sear. And right below the heel is a pivoting bar with a latch on it, the dog. The mainspring has been moved inside, allowing the addition of a buffer which keeps the hammer from falling too far. It borrows the combined pan cover and battery from the Miquelet. Inside, there is the usual sideways slipping Sear, which pulls the knob inward when the trigger is pulled. So, operation. Firstly, the cock is pulled back until the notch on the heel is caught on the latch of the dog. This is probably the most secure safety mechanism, since the dog is entirely independent of the trigger. Only risk is that the dog might eventually fall off or the latch gets chipped, but the chance is rather low. Then you push up the battery and prime the pan. Close the battery. When you're ready to fire, you pull the cock back completely, releasing the dog from it, and latching the heel of the hammer onto the knob of the Sear. When you pull the trigger, the knob retracts inwards, releasing the cock, firing the gun, boom. The original Doglock was invented in Turin, Italy, sometime in the second half of the 16th century. But it was swiftly spread to the Netherlands and England, where it would become known as the English lock. Just like the Miquelet safety mechanism, it allowed the firearm to be kept in a state of loaded readiness compared to earlier models. But unlike the bottom C of the Miquelet, which could easily get worn out, the Dog seems to have been more reliable, meaning that it lasted as an auxiliary safety mechanism well into the 19th century. I've seen cap lock conversions with it. The safety system of teeth latching onto notches in the back of the cock would persist into the French lock. And so, finally, we can move into the flintlock we're so familiar with, the true flintlock, also known as the French lock. Invention of the French lock is usually attributed to Marie Le Bourgeois, a gunsmith born in the mid-16th century to a long line of watchmakers, locksmiths, crossbow makers and gunsmiths. By 1598, he was employed at the French court as a gunsmith and art dealer, believe it or not. The earliest known appearance of Marine's new lock appeared on a musket he made and gifted to Henry IV in 1610, the same year that the king died. In 1615, he gifted a number of such muskets to his son, Louis XIII. Let's take a look then at how Marine's design incorporated the features of all the previous locks. On the outside, it's quite simple, compared to the earlier ones which were quite cluttered with buffers, external springs, sears and dogs. It has a pan, the pan cover and battery, the steel, its V-shaped spring, and then the hammer. Inside is where all of the magic happens. The other side of the hammer's pivot is fixed with a tumbler. It has a forward-facing toe which the mainspring acts against, and keeps trying to push the whole hammer forward, into the steel. The back bottom of the tumbler is round, and cut with a curved notch, kinda like a butt crack. Right behind the butt crack is a sear perfectly shaped for it. The sear pivots up and down like a seesaw. It has an inwards going rod which will interact with the trigger. The trigger does not push against this rod. Instead, the trigger is L-shaped, and when you pull it back, it lifts up the sear instead. This V-shaped spring acts upon the other end of the sear. Let's now take a look at how the flintlock functions. Firstly, you pull back the hammer to half cock. Thus, the butt crack on the tumbler catches the end of the sear perfectly, so that neither of them can move. The gun is now completely safe. You can hang the trigger upon your finger and it won't go off. If you pull the cock further back, the sear latches onto the final ledge on the tumbler, which unlike the half cock position, has no floor to keep the sear from going down. It is the sear spring which keeps it pressing up against the tumbler. But if you pull the trigger, this presses the forward end of the sear down, allowing the tumbler to roll up along it. The hammer falls freely into the frizzen, creates the sparks, boom boom yada yada. It's really easy to see why the flintlock stuck around as the main firearms design for the next 200 years, and lingered on into caplock conversions. It is simple, rugged, easy to understand, maintain and replace, less susceptible to damage since it carries fewer components. If the matchlock is the AK-47 of the 17th century, then the flintlock might be the AR platform equivalent. It is easy to understand why pirates and colonists loved it so much. It was well suited for tropical guerrilla warfare without regular supply lines. However, the flintlock had its issues. It couldn't create sparks as reliably as the Wheellock or matchlock. Many are the accounts of pirate prisoners and victims being saved by the executor's pistols misfiring, sometimes at multiple shots in a row. The individual parts of the lock might also chip away, or the wood could rot and swell and interfere with the mechanisms. For these reasons, the English would largely favor the second Doglock, also called the English lock. Some was simply a regular French lock with a notch on the back of the hammer, and a dog with a latch behind it. And cock the hammer back to half cock and you got a double safety. Pull it to full cock and the dog releases. Another version of the Doglock uses the dog as its only half cock. If we take a look inside, we can see that the tumbler doesn't have the iconic butt crack of the French lock. Instead, the dog on the outside functions as the only half cock. Pull the cock back, the dog releases. The sear latches onto the tumbler and you can fire. The pirates of the Golden Age would have used both French locks and English doglocks of all sorts. But they also would have used different Snaphaunces and Snaplocks, at least in the earlier decades of the 17th century. Miquelets would also have floated around and done the job. It is quite a more varied image than what we usually imagine, aside from the many different barrel and lock materials, wood types, stock shapes, personal customizations, and so on. Seemingly based on the French design, the Portuguese would design a unique Molinhas lock, blending features from the early Molinhas with the French lock. On the outside, the Molinhas is virtually the same as the French lock, except that it has a sort of blocker or catch before the cock. Internally, we can see that it has the mainspring acting upon the cock, as in the early Molinhas system, and that the tumbler lacks a half-cock notch or butt crack like the French lock. So, operating the Molinhas. You pull the cock back to half-cock, which functions like a reverse doglock. The blocker falls backwards and prevents the cock from falling down again. When you pull the cock back to full cock, the catch releases, and the tumbler catches onto the Sear. When you pull the trigger, the Sear pulls out of the full cock notch, causing the hammer to fall forward and into the frizzen. The catch now prevents the cock from falling too far down. The system is very interesting, in that it's sort of a blend between the French lock, Miquelet, and Doglock. Both this system and the early Molinhas are incredibly rare, and I was only able to reproduce this one owing to an excellent pair of images, which I was unable to find for the earlier Molinhas. I've read that one of the faults with the Molinhas was that the tumbler and catch weren't properly fixed, so they risked falling off after repeated usage. So the system wasn't as rugged and reliable as the French lock, likely a reason for why it's so uncommon, but it's nonetheless an interesting and well-designed system. The flintlock could be used for other things than shooting. Instead of priming and loading the gun, the lock could be continuously cocked and fired to produce the sparks necessary to make a fire, maybe even light a trail of gunpowder like in Pirates of the Caribbean. As I mentioned previously, there were flintlock tinderboxes and lighters shaped like pistols. And there were of course flintlock pistols and devices mounted in the weirdest of items, flintlock cutlery, even peg legs, and of course the flintlock pistol sword. Flintlocks could also be fashioned into cannon igniters to replace the linstock. You stick it close to the cannon and pull the trigger. In the late 18th century, the British Navy got the idea of just installing flintlocks directly into their cannons, the so-called gun lock. Mounted just above the touch hole, they were discharged by pulling a lanyard from a preferable distance. This allowed the gunner to take aim more carefully and increase the reload and fire rate. This episode on flintlocks is really just a primer episode for my new series on pirate firearms. In the coming months, we're going to explore all of their different handheld gunpowder weapons. Until the time comes, you might be interested in my series on artillery, which has already been published. Links in the pinned comment below. If you want to see a long future of pirate videos on YouTube, do consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon or becoming a channel member. And don't forget to tell me in the comments which one of the locks was your favorite. See you soon.